Academica Media. You are listening to Charter School Superstars, bringing you the voices of an education revolution.
Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Ryan Kairalla. And our guest this week on the program, one of my favorite people in education to talk to, she is the National Director of Special Education and Student Support for Academica and the host of the Teach the Way They Learn podcast right here on the Academica Media Network. Recently, our guest spoke at the National Charter School Conference about achieving academic equity and addressing the COVID learning gap for students with disabilities and English language learners. You can find out more about our guest's work by visiting www.academica.org. We are happy to welcome Liliana Salazar on a Charter School Superstars. Hello.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm so excited to be here. I typically am not on the other end. I'm typically on your end where I'm doing the podcast. So it's always so nice to be invited to do a podcast. So thank you so much.
Well, if you weren't the hardest working person in education and just super busy, I'd have you on every week because you'd have plenty of great information to share.
You're wonderful. Thank you so much.
This is exciting. So, speaking of things that are exciting, before we get into the actual substance of the presentation you delivered at the conference, which I have been told was a hit.
Thank you.
I want to first just ask you about the feeling of presenting at the conference. How did it feel to be back at that conference and be back in person again for the first time in just too long?
It was just so amazing. It's so nice when one thing is, obviously when you're Zooming and you're doing your webinars, like you try to make it as interactive as possible. But certainly we know that, when you're teaching, when you're face to face, you can really model, do some really nice explicit instruction where they can actually see what we want all of our participants to walk away with and then use in their classrooms. And I was presenting with an amazing co-presenter, David Calvo, and I know that you're going to have him on Charter School Superstars very soon. And the fact that we were able just to also model co-teaching throughout our presentation was just really, really phenomenal. So great to be in front of people again. Great to be able to have that contact to actually model and get them to actively participate in sessions. And it was just a wonderful experience. The Charter School Conference is always just an amazing conference to attend. And I highly recommend to all of your listeners, even if you're not a part of charter schools, but it is a phenomenal educational conference, and I highly recommend for everyone to attend.
Especially when there is a session being led by Lily Salazar and David Calvo. The two of you together, it's Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. It is entertainment, and it is so informative and useful. So getting into the particularities of this presentation, you were talking about addressing academic inequities for students with disabilities and English language learners, and you've noted in the past, and certainly during your presentation, that the risk of learning loss for these particular populations due to the pandemic is particularly significant. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because as it is, students that have a disability or students that are learning English as a second language already got a challenge, already got an obstacle, right? So obviously learning does not come or is not as easy as for a student that does not have a disability or is not learning English as a second language. So you already have that obstacle or challenge that you're dealing with, right? And then compound it. Now we're in a pandemic where I'm not able to go to brick and mortar. I'm not able to actually see my teacher, have her, use the explicit instruction, me interact with my peers so that I can learn that information, retain that information. It's a big, big difference. So obviously, specifically these two subgroups really, really struggled a lot during the pandemic. And now we are just desperately trying to make up that gap. And the only way that we can really do it is by just using evidence-based instructional strategies, things that scientifically work is what we need to be doing with all of our students, but even more so those that have disabilities and those that are learning English as a second language, which are now called, Ryan, just so all of us can be on the same page, because this is something that David has been working on, and it's a relatively new term, multilingual learners. So no longer,
I like that.
So no longer do we call them English learners. We call them multilingual learners because there are some students that are learning more than one language at the same time. So that you're going to be seeing that term multilingual learners a lot more, especially now in the future.
I appreciate that terminology because I think English language learners, and I was using that term earlier because that's sort of how I was brought up with
Right?
it.
Same with me.
But
Same with me.
that sort of implies a deficit mindset, right? Like the idea that they are missing something that they have to learn, when in reality, many of these people that we would call English language learners are people that have already learned one or maybe even multiple languages at home, and they're continuing their multilingual journey, which certainly isn't a deficit.
Thank you, Ryan. That's exactly why they changed it to the term. That's exactly why. So thank you for explaining that, because
That's
that's the way we have to look at things. We have to focus when we're working with children, with all types of children. We must have that approach of assets based. What are their assets? What are their strengths? And let's capitalize on that. Yes, focus via interventions on their areas for improvement, but let's capitalize on what they're bringing to the classroom, and let's use that as the springboard to get that learning, facilitated, to get that learning happening in their brain, which was what the presentation was about, which was just understanding what the science of learning is, cognitive science, and then strategies to really build up that science of learning so students are actually learning and retaining the information.
That's an interesting thread of your presentation. I was definitely intrigued by it. This idea of, if we are looking for solutions to close this COVID gap between among multilingual learners and students with learning disabilities, we need not look far. We can look to the evidence-based strategies that already exist, the ideas in cognitive science that are already there to help us close this gap. Can you give us an example of one of these kinds of evidence-based strategies, something that we know works and that we need to implement in classrooms?
Yes, absolutely. One thing that we talk about in great length is wait time, and having, when you ask a question, actually just pausing and giving students an opportunity to think of the answer. Because the beauty behind science of learning is actually how they learn. When you look at the definition, it is, looking at strengthening memory, posing questions, which will help students more effectively retain what they are learning. The true definition of science of learning is, I'm going back and looking at the presentations. I want to give you the exact definition is, by studying human behavior and performance, we can learn much about how our memory works and how deep learning occurs. So when we think of the science of learning, what we're looking at is how the psychology takes into consideration the mind and the specific behaviors that affect learning. In other words, we're looking at the journey, not that the beginning, not the end. We want to look at the process of learning and how we can capitalize on that process of learning. And wait time is a great example, because what happens many times, and Ryan, I'm sure you were one of those kids, because I was one of those kids as well, right? The teacher would ask the question, bang, I was up. My question, like my hand was, even before the teacher finished asking the question, like I already knew the answer, right? And so what happens is that teachers, like, they tend to choose the students that automatically raise their hands, right? But if we train our classrooms to understand that when we ask a question, we are going to wait minimally 5 seconds. And
5 seconds.
We train them. Like we just say, ask the question and you put your hand up and you go 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 with your hands. Then you tell them to raise their hand. Those 5 seconds gives that student with the disability, gives that student that is a multilingual, that opportunity to just get that idea and take it through that brain cycle so that they can actually be able to participate in the class. Because what we know about the science of learning is that if they're able to retrieve that information, then they're able to learn it, because that's when you actually learn something. When you're able to go find it, retrieve it, and bring it back out. So wait time is just such an important strategy. And there is another term with wait time that we shared at the presentation, which is wait time 2. So wait time 1 is that first time when you're asking them to go ahead and wait 5 seconds and then give you the answer. Wait time 2 is when you ask a follow-up question, right? And then you give them another opportunity to think, and then give you the answer, but you're building upon wait time one. You're building upon the first answer. So again, it's just going deep and deeper into learning, and giving these students an opportunity to use their brain. Ryan, we don't use our brains anymore. Like back in the day when you and I, listen, before we had a cell phone, before we had a cell phone, I don't know about you, but I remember, I mean, I'm much older than you, but I remember going when I was working on research papers, going to the library, pulling out a card catalog, looking for the references, the articles that I wanted. Do you remember? Because you went to law school. I'm sure you remember this. Do you remember?
Card catalogs?
Yeah.
I can tell you in law school, we only had on the first week of law school, we had an assignment where we had to actually look something up the old fashioned way using like card catalogs and like key site books in the library. And they told us, look, you may not need to use this very much in practice, but there's going to be that day where you're going to need it. So we're teaching you the very first week of law school. Yeah. And the first and last time I've ever needed to use it was the first week of law school.
Well, imagine.
I'm still waiting for that one moment in my legal career where I got to pull out a card catalog or
but you learned it.
Book. I did.
You learned it, right?
Yeah.
Well, imagine when I was in school, that's how we did research papers, and we used typewriters for Christ's sake. And I remember using liquid paper. It's crazy. But the fact that we had to look for this information and that whole process of learning really makes that information stick. And so I love technology. I'm all about making sure that students can have access to an iPad, to a computer, to a phone to access their education. But I think sometimes we're forgetting not to give them the opportunity to think, to actually go looking, retrieve something. And that's another thing that the science of learning is all about. So, thinking about another evidence-based strategy, we've talked about wait time, but one really important strategy in the science of learning is retrieving that information. And we talked a little bit in the presentation about the retrieval practice, and I just want to read a little bit from the presentation. The concept of retrieval practice focuses not on how we get the information into students' brains, but on how students get information out of their brains. And what cognitive scientists have discovered is that when students struggle to bring that information to mind, that act of retrieving, they're boosting their learning. So I'm going to say that one more time. They're boosting their learning. So it is okay for students to struggle to find an answer. We don't need to spoon feed them, because in reality, we are doing them.
The learning happens in the struggle.
Exactly. Like Yoda would say, real the struggle is, Ryan. Real the struggle.
Man, what I love about some of these evidence-based strategies that you're bringing up here is that while they are powerful, they don't seem as difficult as I would have thought to bring them into an everyday classroom life, but they seem almost self-evident in how they would create a positive impact. I think of something like wait time and the power that's going to have, the usefulness that's going to have for students with learning differences related to processing speed, or for multilingual learners who need a little bit of time maybe to do the translations in their head, or to figure out how to express that thing that's in their head in their second language. Or third language, perhaps, if we're talking about multilingual learners. That's really powerful. And for many teachers, I'm sure they're listening to this being like, I could do that. I could count to 5 before I have students raise their hand.
Listen, it's these practices are it's what I call good old school teaching practices. Those that we were getting when we were growing up, when nothing like technology like this existed. And in defense of our teachers, I know why, for example, they don't practice wait time so much, Ryan, because they are stressed. They've got so much they need to cover. They've got pacing guides. They've got assessments. They've got to get this done, and they've got to do interventions. Like, let me tell you something. My heroes are teachers. And I've always said that I love my principals, and my principals are going to say, oh, but you say you love. I love my principals. But the true heroes are the teachers. They're the ones that are there in the front lines. They're working with those 20 plus children every day, 20 different ways that students are learning. And these are things that they're pressured. But if teachers would understand that just infusing some of these evidence-based strategies into their teaching practice actually in the long run helps students learn. So they won't even get into a situation where they might have to do interventions with a child, where they might have to reteach a concept because they actually got it the first time. Why? Because their brain had to work. They had to look and struggle to get that answer. And they did activities to really make sure that that learning stuck.
That really is. So it sounds like it's a little more work in the short run will save you some time in the long run. But you did bring up a great point there about teachers facing a lot of institutional pressure, maybe on their from their administration or just from their pacing guides or state standards that might draw them away from enacting these what seem like common sense evidence-based strategies to close these gaps. So what role can the charter schools, what role can administrations play in making this needed change happen? What needs to be communicated from the administrators to the teachers to let them know that it's okay and it's encouraged to implement these strategies?
Well, I'm all about professional development. So I think that it's very important that we provide our teachers really good, scientifically evidence-based professional development. I hate walking into schools and when I see presentations and I see teachers on their cell phones, I see teachers, maybe grading papers and they're not actively engaged in professional development. And there we've lost the mark. When we are creating professional development for our teachers, they must be actively engaged, but it must draw their attention. They must want to learn this, but you have to get their attention. So the very first layer is that principals need to have effective professional development. So they need to look at their data. They need to decide what areas do I need to focus on? And that is what my professional development is going to target. They also need to limit all the amount of professional development that they're giving their students. Last year, I went on a huge mission on making sure that all of the Academica supported schools understood what explicit instruction was. And I spent a lot of time with principals, a lot of time with the reading coaches, math coaches, APs, really deconstructing what explicit instruction is, what the 8 components are, and how they need to infuse them into their lesson planning. Because even if they do 50% explicit instruction, you're much better than where you were before. There will be at least 50% of retention going on. So they have to focus on 1 or 2 items, and that's what they have to build upon the entire year. I think that principals need to have an open door policy in the sense that, they need to let their teachers come in and vent and let them and have their, and teachers need to feel like I can go to my principal and I can tell them I'm overwhelmed. This pacing guide is way too fast. My kids are just not getting it and I need support. And that is a very vulnerable point for a teacher to go to your supervisor and say, I need support and I need help. But the only way they're going to do that is if they know that they're not going to be penalized, they're not going to be looked at and, like, oh my God, this is a weak teacher. They're actually going because they need support. And all of that, that's very important because that I'm all about mental health and not just mental health for our students, but mental health for our teachers as well. So principals need, and I'm going to steal this phrase from Judy Marty, but principals need to be walking around and seeing what is happening in their classrooms. And they need to be able to identify, I walked into this classroom, this teacher needs a little support, or I loved what this teacher was doing. Let me praise them. So, I think when you do a combination of that, I think that this overwhelming sense of like, oh my God, it's just so much to do. Teachers will feel supported and they'll be able to focus on the instruction.
I once had an administrator tell me you can tell how effective a principal is by how many cobwebs have accumulated in their office. Because, right, if they're out there in the world, if they're roaming the classrooms, if they are spending very little time in their office and they're actually on the campus interacting with teachers and students and stakeholders, that's an effective administrator. I think you nailed it. Thrilled to be talking with our guest this week, Liliana Salazar, one of our favorites, the National Director of Special Education and Student Support for Academica. Lily, I always learn so much chatting with you, and certainly this interview has been no exception. I'm excited to ask you our final question that we ask all the guests that come on the program, because I think you'll have some pretty cool insight for it. If, with the snap of your fingers, Liliana Salazar, you could make any change to the education system, what change would it be?
If with the snap of my fingers, I could make any change to the education system, what would it be? Wow. That's a big one, because boy, what do I want to make some major changes in education? Wow, that is a big one. Um, let's see. I think when I'm thinking about just the groups that I work with the most, which are students with disabilities and multilingual learners, I think that if I could snap my fingers, I would help teachers understand what these children bring to the classroom and how we need to be cognizant of that. And I'm going to give you an example. We might have a multilingual learner in our classroom that just came from a country that's been in war for over 2 years. Maybe they haven't been to school for 2 years. Maybe their parents were shot in front of them. Maybe their parents pushed them over the border and said, "You're on your way, get to the United States." Um, maybe they're fighting and they're angry and it's because they're hungry. Do we know that some of our kids are living in cars because they're homeless? Do we know some of our students that have disabilities? The parents don't have enough money to buy the medication, so they're not taking their medication to help them. For example, if they have ADD or ADHD. So if I could snap my fingers, I would want all teachers to walk into a classroom and capture everything that their students are going through, and how, when we need to understand that, because when we get them in front of us, we need to understand, this is what all my kids are going through right now. How am I going to change my pace? How am I going to teach differently so I can meet all of their needs? And it's very important to understand what our kids have gone through, what they're going through right now, because if they're not in a good place, they're not going to learn. It doesn't matter how many evidence-based strategies you use. So snap my fingers, get a magical wand, and just wave it. So I know within 15 seconds, I know Ryan didn't eat last night. Ross is sleeping in a car. Michael saw his parents, get into a really big argument, and so on and so on. Capture all of that so that I can really individualize and meet their emotional needs so that then they can learn.
That's really powerful insight. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for being on the show this week.
Absolutely. I'm so glad when I get invited, because I run a podcast, but now I'm so glad to be a part of one. Now I remember what it is to be a part of a podcast,
Well, on either side of the microphone, you are pretty dang entertaining, and we really enjoyed having you this week. And we really enjoyed having you all checking us out on Charter School Superstars.
The views expressed on the preceding program have been those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views of Academica, its clients, staff, affiliates, or advertisers.